remember where you were when you heard about Challenger?
Mm.
It's like burned into our memories. Wow.
Yeah, it really is.
You guys sent us some really interesting articles and notes about it. And so today we're going to dive deep into the Challenger disaster.
Absolutely. Should be fascinating.
We're going to look at what happened, but also why it matters, all these years later.
It's so interesting how certain events become these cultural touchstones, and Challenger's definitely one of those. But when you start to look at the details, you realize it's more complex than we remember.
Yeah.
Much more complex.
It's easy to just picture, those classrooms full of kids, the excitement around Kristen McCall, the teacher in space.
Right.
But it's easy to forget that this was already the 10th shuttle launch that year.
Yeah, that's right.
So NASA was under a ton of pressure to make spaceflight routine.
Almost mundane,
Yeah.
Which makes the tragedy even more stark, I think.
Right.
It wasn't some grand singular event. It was almost business as usual.
Yeah.
Until, obviously, it wasn't.
Until it wasn't.
So let's go back to that cold January morning in Florida.
And it was unusually cold.
January 28th, 1986, and really unpack what went wrong.
It was. I mean, who expects freezing temperatures in Florida?
Right.
All the sources point to just how important that cold snap was.
Absolutely. It played a critical role.
Yeah.
The immediate cause was the failure of an O-ring.
Okay.
One of those tiny components that can have huge consequences.
Right.
Imagine a giant rubber band, 38 feet in diameter,
Wow.
but only a quarter-inch thick, responsible for sealing segments of the solid rocket booster.
A quarter-inch. That doesn't seem like much to hold all that power.
It was a known design vulnerability, and the cold made it worse. You see, O-rings let this flexibility in low temperatures become brittle.
Okay.
And as the shuttle launched, the O-ring didn't seal properly, allowed a jet of hot rocket fuel to escape.
And that's what we see in those images,
Yes.
That plume of smoke and the booster rocket twisting away.
Exactly. That breach led to a rapid loss of pressure, ultimately causing the shuttle to break apart 73 seconds after liftoff.
It's chilling to think that the astronauts were still alive for a bit after that initial breakup.
Yeah, the detached crew cabin, it continued on an upward trajectory for almost a minute before crashing into the Atlantic.
Oh, wow.
It's a grim reminder of the incredible forces involved.
Yeah.
How even the most advanced technology can be vulnerable to seemingly small failures.
Yeah. Which brings us to that infamous teleconference the night before the launch.
Right.
The sources really get into the human drama that unfolded as engineers tried to warn NASA.
Yeah, this is where the narrative gets more complex.
Okay.
This is where normalization of deviance starts to come into play.
Okay.
We often hear about those Morton Thiokol engineers who were worried about the coal, but it wasn't as straightforward as it's sometimes presented.
So it wasn't just, heroic engineers being silenced by heartless bureaucrats.
Not exactly. The engineers had noticed some O-ring erosion on previous launches, but they hadn't definitively linked it to temperature. They had a feeling something could be wrong, but they lacked hard data to justify stopping the launch.
And to be fair to NASA, they were pushing for that data.
Right.
They weren't just ignoring safety concerns.
Absolutely. NASA kept asking for evidence,
Right.
for concrete proof that the cold posed an unacceptable risk.
But there's also that debate about how the engineers presented their data
Yeah.
during the teleconference.
Uh-huh.
Some experts believe that the way the information was visualized actually made it harder to communicate.
That's right. Data visualization specialists have argued that the slides they used were cluttered. They lacked clarity, made it difficult for NASA to grasp how serious the problem could be. Imagine trying to convince someone about a critical issue using a chart crammed with tiny labels and unclear data points.
It's almost like trying to explain a complex concept in a language the other person just doesn't understand.
Right.
No matter how important the message, if it's not communicated effectively, it won't get through.
Exactly. However, some engineers who were actually at the teleconference, they disagree with the bad data visualization idea.
Right.
They argue that the real issue was the lack of conclusive evidence.
Okay.
They simply hadn't tested the O-rings at such low temperatures.
So maybe bad visuals weren't the smoking gun.
Right.
But what about those Morton Thiokol managers who supposedly overruled the engineers?
Yeah.
Were they really just heartless bureaucrats pushing for a launch at any cost?
That too is more nuanced than it seems at first. It turns out the engineers were actually overruled by their own managers at Morton Thiokol, not directly by NASA.
Okay.
These managers felt immense pressure to deliver on their contract,
Right.
and they argued that without definitive data, delaying the launch wasn't warranted.
So it's less about a sinister cover-up and more about a complex system where everyone is kind of caught in a web of pressure.
Exactly. And to truly understand those pressures, you need to zoom out even further, look at the bigger picture of NASA's culture in the 1980s.
This is where it gets really interesting, I think.
Yes.
What was driving NASA to launch shuttles almost every month?
Right.
Like, what kind of environment were they operating in?
You know, you have to remember, after the triumph of the Apollo missions, NASA was facing an identity crisis. They had achieved the seemingly impossible landing humans on the moon, but now what?
Yeah.
Public interest in space had waned.
Right.
And politically, there was a push for NASA to become more efficient,
Okay.
more like a business.
The dreaded B word, bureaucracy.
Yeah.
So they weren't just explorers anymore. They were expected to turn a profit.
In a way, yes. The space shuttle program was meant to make spaceflight commercially viable.
Okay.
They sold cargo bay space to private companies and aimed to make launches routine, like a space-age postal service.
They actually had a target of 60 launches per year, didn't they?
They did.
That seems incredibly ambitious, maybe even reckless.
It was an ambitious goal driven by political and economic pressures. The reality was that NASA was understaffed,
Right.
underfunded, and increasingly reliant on external contractors like Morton Thiokol.
And this push for efficiency, for hitting those launch targets, inevitably led to some compromises, right?
Well, this is where normalization of deviance really comes into play.
Okay, let's break that down. What does normalization of deviance mean in this case?
It describes a gradual process where what starts as an anomaly, in this case the O-ring erosion, becomes accepted as part of normal operations.
Okay.
Because previous shuttles had flown successfully, despite this damage, those concerns were downplayed. It created a dangerous blind spot, a collective acceptance of risk that set the stage for disaster.
It's like they became desensitized to the danger.
Yeah.
What initially raised red flags eventually became just another acceptable quirk.
That's a good way to put it. And it's something that can happen in any organization, in any industry, even in our personal lives.
Right.
We often become used to small risks,
Yeah.
overlooking potential danger until it's too late.
It's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, what small compromises are we making in our own lives that could have unintended consequences down the road?
Yeah.
It really does.
It's a question worth thinking about. We tend to focus on immediate causes,
Right.
on technical glitches or individual errors. But the Challenger disaster reminds us to look deeper
Yeah.
at the systems and pressures that shape those choices.
And in this case, the system itself was kind of pushing NASA towards a catastrophic outcome.
Precisely. The Challenger disaster wasn't just a technical failure, it was a failure of imagination, a failure to fully grasp the risks that were right in front of them.
And as the sources point out, it was a failure that NASA, tragically, repeated in 2003 with the Columbia disaster.
Right.
But we'll get into that in the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah, we'll delve into that next time. Welcome back to our deep dive into the Challenger disaster. It's interesting, as we were discussing before, the Challenger disaster often serves as a cautionary tale about groupthink
Yeah.
and bureaucratic inertia.
It makes you think about the everyday compromises we all make, right?
Yeah.
I mean, do we ever stop and think if we're slowly normalizing dangerous behaviors?
That's a great point.
Like NASA did with the O-rings.
It really is. And it gets to the heart of this concept of normalization of deviance.
Right.
When things go slightly wrong, but not disastrously so,
Yeah.
we tend to adjust our definition of normal and just accept the risks.
Right.
It's a slippery slope.
Yeah,
And it's something we all need to be aware of,
for sure.
not just in high-stakes environments like space exploration.
Like that saying, the only difference between screwing around in science is writing it down.
Right.
Except in this case, NASA was writing it down.
They were.
They were meticulously documenting the O-ring erosion.
Yeah.
But they still didn't fully grasp the danger.
That's right. They had the data,
Yeah.
but they lacked the critical thinking to connect the dots, to recognize the pattern.
Yeah.
Each time the O-rings eroded but didn't cause a catastrophic failure,
Right.
it kind of reinforced the belief that it was an acceptable risk.
You mentioned earlier that NASA tragically repeated some of these mistakes with Columbia
Yes.
in 2003.
Yes.
It's hard to believe that after such a devastating loss, they wouldn't have learned their lesson.
It is heartbreaking. And it speaks to how deeply ingrained these systemic issues can be.
Yeah.
In the case of Columbia, a piece of foam insulation broke off the external tank during launch,
Right.
and it struck the shuttle's wing, damaging the heat shield that protects it during reentry.
So another seemingly minor issue,
Exactly.
but huge consequences.
Exactly. And the parallels with Challenger are, they're chilling.
Yeah.
In both cases, engineers flagged the issue. O-ring erosion in Challenger, foam strikes in Columbia.
Right. But their concerns were either downplayed or not acted upon decisively.
So even after Challenger, NASA was still struggling with this normalization of deviance.
Yeah, I think so.
They saw a problem, they documented it, but they didn't truly address it.
Yeah, and it points to how persistent organizational culture can be, even in the face of tragedy. NASA implemented a number of reforms after Challenger,
Right.
but they hadn't fully exorcised the ghosts of their past. The pressure to maintain launch schedules, secure funding, demonstrate the shuttle's viability, all of that remained.
It's almost like they were trapped in a cycle.
Yeah.
Like they needed to keep launching to justify the program,
Right.
which led them to downplay risks, which made the launches more dangerous.
That's a very astute observation.
Yeah.
It highlights that tension between exploration and risk. The desire to push boundaries,
Right.
to achieve great things that often comes with inherent dangers.
The key is to find a balance,
Yeah.
to recognize and mitigate those risks
Right.
without stifling innovation and progress.
But that balance seems so elusive,
It is.
especially in organizations like NASA, where the stakes are so high
It is.
and the pressure is immense.
It's a constant challenge,
Yeah.
and it requires a culture that values not just success,
Right.
but also safety, transparency, accountability.
Sure.
It requires leaders who are willing to listen to dissenting voices,
Yeah.
who prioritize safety over expediency.
So in a way, the real lesson of Challenger and Columbia isn't just about technical failures or bad decisions.
Yeah.
It's about building a culture that can learn from mistakes and adapt.
Absolutely.
Right.
These disasters remind us that even the most brilliant minds and sophisticated systems
Right.
are susceptible to human error and systemic biases.
Yeah.
And in these high-stakes environments, a single oversight, a moment of complacency, can have devastating consequences.
It strikes me that NASA was, in a sense, a victim of its own success. Those early triumphs,
Yeah.
like the Apollo missions,
Yeah.
created this aura of invincibility,
Yes.
almost a sense of destiny.
That's a very insightful point. Past successes can sometimes breed overconfidence,
Right.
leading us to underestimate the risks and challenges ahead.
So what can we, as individuals and as a society, learn from these tragedies?
Right.
It's not like we're all launching rockets into space.
True, but the principles are universal.
Okay.
The Challenger and Columbia disasters really underscore the importance of open communication,
Yeah.
critical thinking, and a healthy respect for risk.
Sure.
They remind us that even when facing pressure, to perform, meet deadlines, or stay within budget, we must never lose sight of safety and ethical considerations.
It's easy to get caught up in the daily grind, right?
Yeah.
Become complacent, to just accept things as they are.
Yeah.
But these disasters are powerful reminders that we must always be willing to ask tough questions,
Yeah.
to challenge assumptions, and to speak up when we see something that isn't right.
It's about fostering a culture where vigilance is valued, where dissenting voices are heard, and where mistakes are seen as opportunities for learning and improvement.
It's about recognizing that even small compromises, seemingly insignificant deviations from procedures, can set off a chain reaction with devastating consequences.
Precisely. The Challenger and Columbia disasters are tragic testaments to the fact that we must constantly strive to be better, to learn from our past, and never take safety for granted.
Okay, so we've delved into the technical failures, the human errors, and the systemic pressures
Yes.
that led to these disasters. But what about the aftermath? How did these events reshape NASA's culture and approach to spaceflight?
That's a great question. Did they merely treat the symptoms, or did they truly address the underlying disease? Did NASA really change? We'll explore that in the final part of our deep dive.
That's the big question. Can an organization as big as NASA actually change?
Yeah.
Or are those patterns just too hard to break?
It's a question that goes way beyond just NASA, right? It's about how we handle risk and responsibility in any large system. But in the case of NASA, they did take action. Right after both disasters, there was a wave of reforms investigations.
Right after Challenger, there was the Rogers Commission, right?
Yes.
They really dug into what went
I
wrong
did a deep dive.
and made all sorts of recommendations.
Exactly. And the recommendations covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
They called for restructuring the shuttle program's management,
Okay.
increased safety oversight, and a renewed focus on engineering rigor.
So they were trying to tackle those systemic issues we've been talking about.
Yes.
The normalization of deviance, that
Mhm.
pressure to put production first.
Yes. And there was a definite shift in attitude, at least at first. Safety became the top priority.
Okay.
There was more emphasis on open communication, encouraging engineers to speak up without fear.
Did they also address the over-reliance on those outside contractors?
Yeah.
Which seemed to be a factor in both disasters.
There was a conscious effort to bring more expertise back in-house,
Okay.
reduce that dependence on contractors, foster a stronger sense of ownership over the whole program.
It sounds like they were on the right track, at least on paper.
Yeah.
But did the changes last?
Right.
Did NASA actually become a safer, more transparent organization?
That's where it gets tricky. While the initial response was strong, over time, some of those old habits crept back in. You know, the pressure to keep the launches on schedule,
Right.
to secure that funding,
Yeah.
to prove the shuttle was viable, that didn't just vanish.
So those same pressures that contributed to the disasters were still there, even after the reforms.
Yes. And this becomes tragically clear with the Columbia disaster.
Yeah.
Despite the lessons they were supposed to have learned from Challenger,
Mm.
you see the same pattern. Risks downplayed, engineers' concerns not fully addressed, mission schedule taking priority over potential safety issues.
They treated the symptoms, but didn't cure the disease.
That's a good way to put it.
They made some changes, but didn't really change the culture.
Yeah, it shows just how difficult it is to change a large organization.
Right.
Those deep-seated patterns, those systemic pressures, they're tough to change.
It's a bit discouraging, honestly.
Yeah.
If even a tragedy like Challenger couldn't get NASA to change, what hope is there for other organizations with similar problems?
I wouldn't say it's hopeless. It's
Okay.
more like a call for us to always be vigilant. It reminds us that safety and ethical conduct, they're not destinations, they're journeys.
Right.
They require constant effort, self-reflection, a willingness to challenge how things are done.
So new rules and procedures aren't enough.
Right.
We need a culture where everyone feels responsible for safety,
Yes.
where people feel like they can speak up.
Exactly. And it's about leaders setting the tone,
Okay.
prioritizing transparency, accountability, creating an environment where mistakes are seen as chances to learn, not opportunities to blame.
So it's acknowledging that we all make mistakes.
Yeah.
Even the brightest minds, even with complex systems,
Yeah.
we're all vulnerable. And pushing boundaries, whether it's in space or any other field, has to be balanced with a deep respect for risk.
Absolutely. Challenger and Columbia remind us that we can't become complacent. We can't assume we have it all figured out.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm struck by just how much NASA accomplished
Yeah.
and the bravery of those who risk their lives to push the limits of what's possible.
It's incredible, but we have to remember the risks involved
Right.
and commit to learning from the past.
And those lessons apply to all of us, not just in space travel.
Absolutely, in every aspect of life.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Challenger disaster. We hope it's given you something to think about.
Yeah, we hope you have a new appreciation for the complexities of what we do and how important safety, ethics, and constant improvement are.
If you enjoyed this exploration of complex systems, make sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive. We'll keep bringing you thought-provoking content.
Helping you uncover those hidden layers of knowledge in all sorts of fascinating topics.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep learning.